Welcome to Martial Wisdom. Here you can listen to conversations on all kinds of topics related to martial arts. In today's episode, we discuss a controversial topic, and that is Aikido a complete art? Joining me for this discussion is Dan Trailescu. Before we start, please consider supporting the show. You can subscribe to the Spirit Aikido online program, which currently contains more than 170 videos. Another option is to contribute any amount you like through the PayPal tip jar. Even small contributions are greatly appreciated. I hope you enjoy this episode. Now, on with the discussion. Welcome to Modern Aikidoist podcast. Today I've got on Dan Philip Trailescu, and he's an Aikidoka and instructor from the UK. And he's also gotten into teaching practical self-defense. And I came across him on a podcast that was wonderful that he was on with Ian Abernathy. And I'm going to post a link to it in the show. Everybody should go check it out. But when I heard it, I just really had to talk with Dan. So Dan, welcome. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Tristan. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Well, before we get into our topic, maybe you could give just a little bit of a background of your martial art journey.
Started the most classic, which is I started when I got to university. So I was there were a couple of martial arts clubs. I happened to walk into Aikido first. So I've been doing that for about 15 years. I got into kickboxing about 6 months after I started Aikido, which was a little bit different, and then sort of caught the bug and dabbled in a bunch of other stuff while I was at uni and after. Started reading a few things about self-defense kind of a few years into training, and started talking to some people and realizing that maybe there's a little bit more to the story. Started randomly saw that Rory Miller was in the UK for a seminar, went there to train with him, been training with him ever since, about a decade now. And then some other people through that, and work took me to a couple of places, eventually Cyprus, where I kind of inherited a dojo. So someone was there and he was teaching, and I was training there for 2 years, and then he said he didn't want to do it anymore and asked if I wanted to kind of keep it going. And then that's when I started kind of, like, I had been training self-defense in Aikido myself before that, but then I started also teaching it and kind of seeing about combining those things. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean,
cool. Yeah, I've got a high regard for Rory Miller. I think his book, Meditations on Violence, was probably the most profound book on martial arts I've ever read. And that's saying something, because I'm a bit of a bookworm when it comes to it. I will dig into a lot of books, but it was a really good wake-up call for the difference between training in a dojo and then what goes on with real violence.
Yeah, 100%.
And that was one of the first books I read that sort of opened the door to exploring more with reality-based training. And like you, I found live people that could mentor me with that. And I've been doing that 10, 12 years now. And I view that those experiences are invaluable, not just the reading the books, but the training with people who have real life experience. And I put Rory right up there at the top of the top scale of a ton of real world experience. Well, the topic we wanted to get into today is Aikido a complete art? And in order to set the stage for the conversation, I think we can cover the first thing, which for any intelligent discussion is to make sure our terms are defined correctly. And that is, a complete art, martial art, is not one that includes every technique that has ever been used in combat since time began. And I think that it's easy to think, well, no art is complete, so therefore that's the excuse for why a super specialized art can only have like just a few things that it does, and it misses a lot of general things. I think the question would be, is Aikido a comprehensive art, or is it well-rounded enough to be a basis for martial art training? So when we say, is it a complete art, it doesn't mean can it do everything, and are practitioners of Aikido able to have every tool at their disposal, as I think that's just a ridiculous premise anyway. What are your thoughts on that approach?
Well, first, I mean, with the question, is Aikido a complete art? Clearly, we're really staying away from controversial topics here. But yeah, I 100% agree that we need to define the terms, because when people say complete art, particularly on the internet, they mean very, very different things. Mm-hmm. And like you say, I think does it do everything is an unrealistic premise, because whenever someone says that, like, my art is complete because they have all ranges of combat or something like this, if you use a definition of ranges of combat that's put forward by another art or somebody else, generally they don't anymore. It's only by their own definition that they have everything. That's usually the case. So I think for me, there are two definitions of complete art in the way that it's used that actually makes sense. And one of them is that it, like you said, it's comprehensive enough to allow basis for a martial endeavor of whatever fight kind of image you have in your head, you know, whether that's self-defense, whether that's sporting combat, whether that's historical combat, you have whatever you have, that art has enough different things to be applicable to that domain. And I think the other definition for me that makes sense, and I'm not sure complete is the best word, but sometimes when people use it and you dig down, this is what they mean, is that it's internally consistent. So that for the specific, within the training environment that the martial art has, and for its own goals for martial training, it does everything that it claims to do, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry?
I think so. Kind of like a boxer would say, my art is complete because he would go into a boxing realm and he knows everything that that he would face in a boxing match. Kind of.
Yes. Yes, basically. Yeah, it's within the realm of my training. This art functions without adding anything else to it, right? And I mean, can we agree that those are sort of two different definitions that both might be?
Oh, absolutely.
Sort of,
yep.
Yeah.
And I wanted to clarify this, not to say that I think you and I were going to be on a total different wavelength, but as listeners come in, especially you listen to anything on the internet, it's a classic skill of finding, well, what can I argue with? What can I pick away at? You know, like, let's make sure that we got the ground rules of what we want to talk about. And the complete art opens the door for so many different interpretations that right from the get-go, somebody can say, nope, it can never be. So there's no point to even discussing it. And I think that there's room in there, especially as people look at, like, a potential person says, maybe I want to take up martial arts. And I've been asked by so many people, like, what art would be good for me? Or what should I be looking for in a martial art? And because they're lay people, they have no idea about the depth of martial arts. And they are kind of like going to buy a car and they want to sort of kick the tires. Like, okay, is this one got the features I want, or is this one does not? And they often think that, well, I want one that includes kicking, punching, weapons, grappling, all kinds of different things. And, like they would buy a car that's got air conditioning and power windows and heated seats and the whole 9 yards. And this show might actually help somebody understand better, like, what sort of martial art would I want to get into, just as a sideline. But I think from we practitioners realizing, if that is the sort of person that is looking for an art, I think what they don't really want to hear is, well, we only do a couple little things. Like, the car we're selling really only has one seat in it, and it doesn't have power anything, and it doesn't have air conditioning, but it's not supposed to. It's kind of a marketing issue as much as it is a practical function issue. And, once you get into practicing the art and are in it for a while, you think of it in terms of function, like, what can my martial art do? But we're missing, I think, the part of the image of what Aikido tends to be viewed as. And I mean, I don't like thinking of any art just as a collection of techniques, but to say that, well, we just do a bunch of throws and joint locking, like, that's kind of the layperson's view of Aikido. Similar to the fact that they looked at judo as well. It's a bunch of hip throws. It's simplistic, it's not accurate, but that's the perception.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, like, when someone comes looking for, to use the same analogy, a car, or in this case, a martial art, the first question should be, what are you going to use it for? Right? Because you want a sports car, that's going to be different than you want something that can go off-road, which is different than you live somewhere with rush hour traffic and bad parking. I used to drive a Smart. When you're in a big city, it's great, right? If you're going on like 10-hour road trips, not so much.
Right. Or you want to haul lumber.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same with martial arts. It's, what is it for? And you're starting to say, I don't really know. Like, that's cool. Then just taking a look at what's out there, trying things. But it's one of the issues with defining complete art is that martial arts are generally they originally, or their ancestor arts arose in situations of conflict, right? That's the whole point. And so they tend to be designed with particular conflicts in mind. And it's not so much a case of design. No one went there and said, well, I think this is the fight we're going to have. This is what we'll do with it. These fights happened. People did things. Some of these things worked and they got codified. And then they got refined by people who had time on their hands because they weren't fighting all the time, right? That's how we end up with martial arts from fighting systems. And different arts have different things in mind with that. And I think, like you say, it's a marketing issue. The problem becomes when what people are looking for and maybe what people are selling doesn't actually match what happens in the training environment.
Absolutely.
And I mean, what you were saying with the image, so that's an interesting one for Aikido, because the image that people see with Aikido is usually high-ranking instructor effortlessly throwing people around, which is really great. Like that is, from a martial arts perspective, a lot of these guys are amazing. A lot of what they do is amazing, but without context, there's a few problems with that being kind of the image, because people who don't have any context of violence might go, oh, is this what a fight is actually going to look like if I get that good? Probably not. Even for those guys, not really, not for real. The ukes are doing quite a lot of the work, which doesn't take away from the skill, but it's its own particular thing. It's a particular martial practice. And it's a good one for driving people to kind of refine their technique and get really good at working with a compliant partner and, beautiful movement and all that. And sure, some high level skills and principles, some people are really, really good at that. But it's a particular image. And if you just see that, it gives you one particular idea. And that's not the only thing that, can happen within this art, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that, perception is always, with any business, is you say, how is my product or my service perceived? And that has a lot to do with the appeal. And I know that Aikido is having a big marketing issue these days, with waning popularity, and I think a lot of the arguments and criticisms that are out there of Aikido, which I believe a lot of them are quite valid, are that it's drifted so far away from practicality that it's become a choreographed dance kind of practice, which it's fine. There's no disrespect to the physical learning of complicated choreography, but the idea that somebody says, well, I want to learn to protect myself, and they see a disconnect with that. And I think perhaps with YouTube videos of fights, real fights, and real violence, even a layperson can see an Aikido demonstration and see a real fight and say, these things don't look anything like one another. Like it's so blatant. And I think the having that light of truth and reality shown makes some people feel uncomfortable, especially in the Aikido world, where it starts to tear away the illusion that what they're doing is real world practical. And what I've noticed from a lot of the Aikido community, not all of it, but a good portion of it, is the response has been to shrink away and say, we're not doing that at all. We're not training or training our students to be practically defend themselves from violence. Like they just kind of walked away. And I think that's a distancing from something that O-sensei would find probably not, he would not be impressed by that. Because the impression I got of him is that he was very much intent on protecting himself, and that his martial art was capable of doing that. And the same thing with Gozo Shiota, all of the primary students and the students of that age.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing is that, a lot of these people lived during a time of quite extreme violence in terms of wars and things like this, and has certainly had some exposure to it. And with O-sensei in particular, his attitude shifted quite a lot throughout his lifetime. And it's very difficult to untangle how much of a shift in Aikido culture came from that and how much came from just Japan's shift after World War II, which was sort of an overall thing. Sure. And then how much of the modern Aikido attitude is marketing, because we are the peaceful martial art is a really nice niche, especially when Aikido was being proliferated, when everybody else was doing something different, right? Everybody else is going, we're so badass. And these guys show up and go like, well, we're peaceful. Come train with us. Right. We're nice. Sure. And I think for me, we have this this sounds weird coming from me, because obviously I like doing self-defense training and I like my training to be practical, and that's what I want to give to students. But I think in the martial arts, we are a little obsessed with it sometimes. Like there's a lot of good practices that have nothing to do with self-defense. But when you ask people, like, do you do competition? No, we don't do any competition. That's fine. Do you do any spiritual stuff? No, we don't do any of that. That's fine. So do you also not do self-defense? Of course we do self-defense. Everyone feels like they kind of need to do that. And I think, as you said, within Aikido, sometimes you get this. I actually like it when people say explicitly, this is not what we do. Because I think when a martial arts student shows up, if it's not said explicitly, they assume they are getting self-defense training, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
I think that's universal.
Yeah.
They think martial arts, self-defense.
Exactly. And it's better when you say explicitly. On the other hand, I think some people want to have their cake and eat it too, kind of present themselves as doing like a practical martial art, but then when actually asked, do you do any of this stuff for self-defense? No, we're not really interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
That wink, wink thing. And I think that's that I'm not so cool with. It's like, you know, if you're not doing it, own it.
And the additional layer is when those people tend to talk trash about how dangerous their art is, and that's why they don't do it, is it would kill somebody. And well, how do you know? You know, it's how can you how can you have an arrogance like that when you have not really gone and trained into that or have performed in that level? You know, and there's plenty of videos bursting, seeing those bubbles burst when challenged, and you know, there's plenty of that out there to see.
Well, that's an interesting one that you bring up with the challenges, because I mean, you know, the argument is valid that sparring isn't like real, but it's a great training tool, and it's a great tool for having a bit of a reality check sometimes, you know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But something that you see, and this is not universal to Aikido, you see this in a lot of martial arts that, or particular groups within martial arts that don't have sparring, is when they're first exposed to it, something tends to happen. So you see this in a lot of things that know it happens in karate. Is someone who doesn't do a lot of sparring, but is a high rank, goes and decides to spar at contact. And they will generally get beaten up. That's what would happen. That's certainly what happened to me the first time I sparred, right? That's just how it works. Sparring is it, you know this. I know you have a background in full contact. You know the sparring is its own skill set. The first time you do it, you will not be very good at it. And what tends to happen is people's reactions, they tend to go one or the other extreme. Either they go, oh, this sparring is bullshit, I'm never doing this again, you know, go back. Or they tend to go, everything I've done so far is BS, I'm now going to go train in that and trash talk my old art all the time because, you know, I've now discovered that this is so much better. Whereas this is from a podcast, I cannot remember which one or who was on it. That does full contact sparring, and they were talking about it took people who came from other dojos who didn't have the background about a year to catch up. Mm-hmm. And that isn't like a year to get to the level of someone who's been doing it a year. That's a year to catch up to their previous rank, to what they actually had. So it takes time. So when you introduce these things, people often kind of want to do we're going to do like one reality check and see how this works. It's like, no, you need to do that consistently and train within it. You know, and you need to do different ones, because I mean, let's be real, nothing we do in the dojo is 100% real.
Right? And it can't be. Like, that's an unsolvable training problem. Yeah,
exactly. Because we're quite rightly, we're not comfortable just going like, okay, guys, we're going to test this. Here's 2 sharp knives, you know, go. Right. Mm-hmm. Like that's not, you know, so everything we have to work around it. And I think one of the things that, you know, we can talk about with Aikido is the because specialization of technique is one thing, but it's also very specialized in training method.
Yes.
Right. Most dojos pretty much only do one thing. Mm-hmm. And
well, yeah. As I was thinking about preparing for this episode, I've always liked, when you study something that happens in history, almost always you have to study what led up to it. Like, what was the circumstance that brought that occurrence about? And then you just keep going back, like what caused that to come about? And then what caused that to come about? And where I with this subject, where I came back to was so many people in the mid 20th century who came to O-sensei to learn from him were high-level martial artists already in judo, sumo, karate, I mean, these are like black belt level martial artists. And so it would make sense to me that a sensei didn't say, I'm going to go reteach you what you already know. He said, all right, I'm not going to bother teaching a bunch of hip throws to a bunch of judo people. Instead, I'm going to add to what you already have and add on to that understanding. And there's probably some significant alterations from whatever background those people had. But then you imagine a student coming and saying, I don't have any background whatsoever. I don't know how to do throws. Nothing. Teach me from the very beginning. Can you take what he taught to advanced martial artists as an add-on and make that the foundation of its whole another art, and have students who become powerful martial artists on their own without any of that other background stuff? Or did he ever say, okay, well, you don't have any judo in your background, let's cover some judo throws so you know what all these other guys know? I've never heard of that happening, but I guess that's my basic question is, if that training methodology is what was copied, and which the Japanese love to do, is they'll take the template they inherited and they'll just keep copying it. Was it complete to start out with, much less to deal with any signal degradation of you just copying what was done before you? Because you'll always lose a little bit of clarity and whatnot, especially without any competition or testing of technique. What are your thoughts on that origin?
Well, that's a really interesting thing to look at. I agree with you pretty much. Like, if you look at Aikido, I mean, we have to remember that we are working with incomplete information here. Like, none of us have a time machine. We can't go look back and see what exactly happened. And then adding to that, when you're talking about self-defense, you're also applying it to an imperfectly defined problem, right? Because self-defense means so many different things to many different people. But just from the perspective of I think Aikido makes a lot more sense if somebody already knows what a fight looks like, right? If they have the background, Aikido as a fighting, as a martial art, it makes more sense if you assume that somebody already knows how to fight. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. A few years ago, somebody asked me at a seminar we were attending, we were sitting around afterwards, and people from a couple of different arts, and somebody asked, so what's the unique thing about Aikido? Because jiu-jitsu, the Japanese styles kind of tend to specialize. So it becomes judo, it becomes karate, they just do the striking. They don't just do the striking, but that's often the perception. Judo has the throws. What does Aikido specialize in? And at the time I didn't have a really good answer. So I was like, well, we do joint locks and throwing and this, but actually Aikido kept a different piece of sort of the old school arts. And the thing that, to my impression, Aikido kept is it didn't turn into a fighting art. Most other martial arts, as they went into the modern day, transformed into fighting arts, even if they weren't to begin with. It became about this kind of one-on-one, fighting, winning the fight. That's not a criticism. That's a good thing. You get good training like that. But that's what most of them transformed into. Aikido, to my mind, is one of the few that didn't have that transformation. So that's something that, to me, makes it suitable for self-defense, because the strategy of most martial arts for self-defense is, I'm losing, because self-defense, I start out losing. I'm going to turn this into a fight, and then I'm going to win that fight, which is a great strategy if you know how to fight. Aikido strategy is something is happening. I'm going to, blend, harmonize, basically accept what's happening and deal with it immediately, and the situation is resolved. Which, as an ideal, right? Of course, that requires a training process that often doesn't match. It doesn't look that simple in practice. The training process is quite messy. But the downside is that just training like this, you don't actually learn how to fight. And to tie it back to what you originally said, that was often assumed knowledge.
Sure.
And the question is, when you do Aikido now, when you teach now, you have to make a decision. Are you going to teach the martial art without that and make it, as good as you can as a martial art, and the students who want to learn to fight go somewhere else? Are you going to primarily teach people who already have a previous background, which I think is a difficult business model?
Very much so.
Or are you going to teach those skills or related skills within your training? And I think that's my take on that, is you have to make that decision, because I can't be 100% certain, but I agree with you that it seems that this was assumed knowledge, and I have never read or seen anything that suggests that kind of that was actually taught to people who didn't have it before.
Right. Well, and that has some pretty big implications on instructors and dojo owners who inherited a curriculum, and I count myself in that same boat. I inherited the curriculum of the organization I started in, and I used their process. I mean, because that makes sense, right? That's what you were taught. But then to realize, is this complete enough to take somebody from a raw beginner? And I mean, I started with a 12-year-old girl. She had no martial art background. She started shortly after I did. What did it take to get her to a point where she was a well-rounded martial artist and could defend herself if somebody put her hands on her? And I wound up kind of being her mentor in preparing her for a black belt test. And it was that point when I kind of awakened and said, we need to do a few more things than what we've been prepared to do, than just the wrist grabs and the shoulder grabs and the shomanuchis and the just straight punches, lunge punches. I felt like, there was a kinship to her. I felt like she was almost my daughter. There was a great deal of affection, not to sound creepy, but she was like one of my own. And I said, if I'm going to have her going about in the world, I want to make sure that has got enough knowledge and skill to protect herself from reality. And so that was kind of the open door. And I think this was about when I was, this is even just before I opened my own dojo, was I took on that level of, awareness of this very short. She was probably, I don't know, 5'2" or something like that. And I'm like, I want to make sure she's potent, she's capable. And with that level of seriousness, it wasn't just a student to me. It was somebody very, that I cared about. And I think in looking, that opened the door for me to say, what does my curriculum need to include to make sure that I do have well-rounded students? And so bringing in things, learning judo and teaching some basic judo throws, not to say that they're, my students are ready to go into a judo competition, but some of their hip throws are fantastic. I mean, judo has got it down when it comes to their throws. They've got some fantastic stuff. And granted, they've got some, just like Aikido, they've got some very intricate stuff that takes a lot of practice to get down. But some of their basics are just phenomenal. And I could say the same thing about virtually every martial art I've ever come across. Same kind of thing. They've got some great basics that can be learned and absorbed quickly, and it doesn't take a ton of practice and dedication of years or decades to get good at, that I think most every martial artist should know or have some exposure to. So that's where that forming your curriculum and not just staying with what you inherited, I think, is an important thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the curriculum forming is that's not an easy thing to do.
No, it isn't. That was probably the most serious and sobering. It took me years to kind of start to rationalize how to do it in a way that was respectful, smart, organized, not haphazard, or accidental, or just appearing to be chaotic. It had to be, orderly and sensible. And the hardest thing was, what do I start to trim out? Because you only have limited training time. If you can't just keep adding things in, you have to start to put stuff on the back burner and start taking things out on it. That's what worried me the most.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I have a couple of thoughts on this, because what you said is spot on. Like that was my experience. When I inherited the dojo, initially I used the syllabus from my teachers, from my organization. And partly because I wasn't confident in grading people. So I would have people over to do gradings, and how it is in the beginning.
Sure.
But what I realized fairly quickly was that what was happening was that we were doing our normal training, and then a couple of weeks before the grading, we were training people differently so they could pass the grading.
Right.
And I called up my instructor and I said, look, this is what's happening. This isn't really the point of grading, says it. The point is not to train for the test. And I was like, look, are you okay if I make my own syllabus? Which, to his credit, he was 100% okay with it. He said, yes, I know you, I trust you.
That's fantastic.
Which doesn't happen that much. It was like, send it to me.
It is. It's pretty rare. That's good.
Yeah. And my parameters were, I wanted to bring in self-defense stuff. And I also wanted to keep enough of the classics in there that if because I knew I was at some point going to leave, if my students go to another dojo, their skill is appropriate for the rank.
Mm-hmm.
So we still had the classic stuff. It's not like we suddenly threw out everything and, you know,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know
you
it was
can't do that.
Aikido.
You can't just start with a blank slate entirely. You got to evolve it.
No. Yeah, you can add stuff, you can integrate stuff with it, which is different than adding things. So this is
Right.
one of the this is what makes it so difficult, because martial arts, I mean, what almost everyone can agree on as far as Aikido, because people love to disagree about it, but almost everyone can agree that Osensei was a great martial artist, like that he knew what he was doing. So he clearly had something in mind with this martial art, and the thing makes sense together. And good Aikido, even completely classical good Aikido, is a great thing to experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know some instructors who do classical Aikido who are amazing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so when you're, but then there's the question of, you know, okay, they can pull it off. That might be different for a student. I might want to do something else. But the thing is, when you're bringing things in, they have to fit. It's not as simple as just going like, oh, well, you know, that art has cool knife defenses and that art has good grappling and that art has nice takedowns. We'll just graft them on, because you end up with some kind of Frankenstein's thing where they don't really fit the original thing anymore. And like what I said before, with Aikido, doesn't turn it into a fight. I think also with training methods, you have to be careful, because sparring and these are wonderful methods, but if that becomes your basis, very quickly what you end up having is that you have a fighting art primarily, and that's cool, but why are you doing Aikido? There's good fighting arts out there with more of a history in that, who are probably better at it.
Right.
I think you absolutely should have them as training methods, and you should use them to try things, and especially experiencing variability and different inputs, and, you know, an opponent who's giving you different problems to solve. I mean, I'm sure you agree with this, that most real learning occurs by problem solving, not by, you know, being told things, right?
Right. Exactly.
So these are all things to consider when you're building a curriculum. What are you bringing in? What are your goals? What are the training methods to do? What I would start with, this is my opinion for anyone listening. What I would start with is, what do you want to accomplish, and what do you think you need to do to get that?
Mm-hmm.
If you primarily want well-rounded martial artists, you're probably going to have to bring in some fighting skills.
Absolutely.
If you want self-defense, you are going to have to set aside some time for soft skills training. There's no way around it. People are going to need boundary setting. They're going to need to be trained in, you know, awareness beyond just like, let's meditate
Body
a
language,
bit
that sort
and
of
talk
thing.
about. Need to practice that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're going to need to learn, like, you know, red flags in relationships is a huge one. So much bad stuff happens with that. You know, especially if you have younger students, they should know this stuff before they, you know, before they hit university, let's say. If we talk about escape, we need to practice it, you know. And then the next thing that I would say, after you decide what are my goals, what do I think I need to do with that, and that's going to be a long trial and error process.
Mm-hmm.
It's, what of this can I take that integrates well with my martial art? Because again, you can do parallel, right? And that's kind of how I started. It was like, okay, we're going to do an hour of Aikido, and then we're going to do an hour of self-defense. But that again, martial arts have this wonderful thing. They through the principles, they integrate everything. You don't need to think about individual movements. You don't need to think about your strategy. It's all integrated within the art. So if you're teaching it separately, you're kind of losing that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simple. You can have fun with it. The simple things, like if you practice break falls, how many times do you practice getting up and sprinting out of that?
Right.
To practice escape, right? Somebody's throwing you. Okay, the next step is probably, if you want to practice running away, well, let's actually practice it, you know, from that. And it has also the side effect that suddenly people's alignment with their feet when they're rolling is better, because with bad foot alignment, you're not sprinting out of that.
Right.
So I think it doesn't. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, as you bring that up, it's also a practice of Zanshin, which is not just saying a fight is, or surviving violence is going to be, once the break fall happens, it's over. Like, because we often do that. We'll segment down and say, well, we're going to hyper focus on this one particular moment of this violent exchange, whether it's I reverse a grip or I evade a punch and take control of a body. But as we know, it goes well beyond that. You know, how do you end it? If you drop somebody, now what? You know, if they pop back up, now you got another problem. Do you go to a pin? If you go to a pin, how do you get back up out of the pin? And, you know, almost all of the Aikido practice that I had done, we'd go to a pin, Uke would tap, and then you'd get up like everything was cool again. Well, what if you get up and that person gets up and comes after you again? I mean, there's, not to say that we're going to get totally into the what if game, but I find that this is something that happened on a lot of rank tests, especially brown and black belt, where the person testing would do the throw and then kind of turn away, like they lost interest in, they were thinking about the next thing they were going to do. And my instructor would say, you've lost your zanshin, you've lost your remaining mind. That person may still be a threat to you. So keep your attention the whole time. But I found that we weren't practicing that during all training for the most part. We'd only do, like you said earlier, we'd only do it for tests. And so it's easy to, what do they say? Your performance will sink to the level of your training. What if your training is at a low level and you lose that zanshin? You think, oh, I've got this. I took him off balance and I threw somebody down and he pops back up and now it's game on. So yeah, I think that there's quite a bit to it. And I agree with you too. I wanted to also address the idea. And I think people will get this impression where they say, well, I teach Aikido. I really like the classical Aikido that I've done and I teach in my dojo or that's in my dojo. I don't want to just slap on a combatives class to it or just carve out time to do combatives. Again, it's like and you put this so well. I really like how the integration part. It's not that Aikido, the techniques and the principles are not applicable to the combative side. I found that they are. It took me a little while of training in the combative side to see it because it looked initially so different. But as I saw it, I kept finding principle after principle and teaching after teaching of Aikido that fit very, very well with the combative type training and the combative material. In fact, now I'd say the combative stuff that I do is kind of squarely right in the middle. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, is what you found of the two of them, where your personal martial arts are. Do you feel that they're weighted towards the combative or weighted towards the Aikido, or where along that spectrum are they? Have you really merged them and integrated them?
That's a really good question. I think the most honest answer I can give is that it varies with different points in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So particularly when I was teaching and probably the last couple of years, sorry, I have to get a tangent here, which is about cross-training.
Sure.
So obviously one of the ways that we can address all these things is by cross-training, and there's very different approaches to this. I think Alice Amdur in his book talked about, the like kind of two families, like your husband with two wives, and you just, when you're with one, you just do that. But what I found for me, what made the biggest difference is when I had something to integrate my training. So I had one thing that is my core, and everything else that I cross-train is in service to that. So this is why, in my view, why, for example, MMA fighters don't have a lot of trouble with cross-training, because they know that the rule system they fight under, this is their thing that integrates it for them, right? They have to step into that cage and do the thing. And so it's not a lot of the typical issues that pop up with cross-training with traditional martial artists who just go from one style to the other and then start, getting footwork issues and principles issues, is from that. Mm-hmm. So the reason for this tangent is because for me, when I started training with Rory, and that approach to self-defense, the physical part of that became the thing that everything else integrates in for me. Mm-hmm. For some time. Now, I think currently I'm, partly because of just what the options are during the pandemic, I'm getting a little bit back into traditional martial arts a little bit more. I've had some, great opportunities, some online groups to just talk and study some wonderful obscure things. I've started doing some more bagua, which I don't do for self-defense. I just really enjoy it. So I think the pendulum kind of swings. Probably self-defense is still my core. That's certainly, since I moved from Cyprus, I don't have a dojo anymore. I teach self-defense seminars sometimes. So that's more in line with that. And that is the core, but I suspect that at some later point in my life that will swing, the other way again.
Sure.
One thing you were saying with the combatives and the Aikido, an interesting thing is, if you look at a lot of martial arts that are generally regarded as more practical, the things that we do in Aikido, particularly the body manipulation, is what they do at a very high level generally. if you just have the image of the wrist grabs and things, okay, that looks a bit basic, but a lot of the body manipulation, that the way that the relationship between uke and tori works in Aikido, if you look at it from a martial perspective, this is things that you find in other martial arts at a high level. So it's good stuff. But like you said,
Absolutely.
it takes a while of training to get there in particular. And this is when you said with the, what ifs if uke gets up, how do you make that decision? Interestingly, my instructor is the same. You better have your attention in uke, and you better, when they tap, you not get up and just kind of turn your back or even look away, but the thing is that what I think is missing from a lot of training is decision making. If you have uke does one attack, maybe jiyu-waza they do different attacks, but it's that one attack, and what you're working on is perfecting your response to that one attack, which is it's nice. It's good. It trains a lot of things. It gives you space to explore things in depth. It can be a really wonderful practice. What it is missing is the idea of having to choose the right time to do these things, which particularly since Aikido is so dependent on what the other, it's so, the whole Aiki blending harmony, it's so dependent on how they're moving. I mean, again, you can see this in a lot of the videos that you mentioned with challenges. People trying to grab someone's wrist and get a wrist lock on in the middle of a fight generally doesn't work.
Correct.
However, when they do something that already sets up most of what you need to be doing, and you find that, it tends to work pretty well. But that requires you to actually have these problems to solve. And it's not, you don't need to go all out with intensity. Variability is just a good place to start.
Very much so, yeah. One of the questions that I wanted to pose is can Aikido actually be an effective art with just that narrow foundation? One of the things, by the way, that I found with adding in to the combative side to help provide a better foundation, and then provide a better foundation for my students, I found that irimi started coming out more. And I think that a lot of Aikido, modern Aikido that I have seen and encountered myself, tends to be heavily weighted towards tenkan, towards giving way, turning out of the way. And that's a valid strategy, but I think there needs to be a 50-50 balance with the irimi of entering. Because when you turn, the intention is you're going to end you're going to end with an irimi. You're setting up uke to enter and end the violent part. And I guess if Aikido is modern Aikido, or what's being taught by and large today, is kind of brought down to the always give way, always turn, is that enough to establish a solid art alone, or is that too hyper specialized? I mean, my personal thought is, like I said, they need to be balanced, and but I think a lot of Aikido practitioners view that a heavy duty irimi is too invasive, or too violent, or too aggressive, perhaps. Maybe that's a big wad of questions to throw at you, but they kind of link together. That's why I wanted to put them all together.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the can it be an effective martial arts? Aikido as a whole, I'm going to say yes. It's not what I would choose to do. And if someone asked me, what should I train for self-defense, classical Aikido would not be the answer I would give them.
Agreed.
But there's a difference between, can it be an effective art, and is it the sort of best, quickest way to get to where you want to go if your goal is self-defense? I think that there's a lot of practices within Aikido that cannot be effective. Sure. I mean, you see, YouTube is full of it. Like there's so many. I mean, as a tangent, I think this can be a pitfall for kind of modifying the training, is when you see these videos that sometimes annoy me a little, where it's like, oh, practitioner of this other martial art like fixes Aikido technique, and often the technique that is being shown isn't done particularly well. Like one of those videos, my instructor and I were watching, and we're pausing it after the initial show and being like, okay, this is our comments. And then unsurprisingly, the other martial artist, who was quite good, gave similar comments. And somebody sent me a video of someone doing a modified thing, like 20-minute video, and asking, like, what do you think? And I'm going, he's got some good points, but also the way he does the classical technique is not great. So I think it's fair to say, I think, that most of what you see as Aikido nowadays is not, in that sense, enough. I think that there are people within Aikido who just do classical who absolutely can make it work. I have enough people in my group who have used it for real to not go, okay, it doesn't work. My impression is that yes, you can make it work. I think that if you're to circle back to the earlier, what are you starting with as a base? If pure Aikido is your base, I think that the time frame for being effective for self-defense is unacceptable if that's your training goal.
Right.
And a lot of organizations also won't teach you any applications either at all, like in that sort of way, or until you get to very high level. I mean, one person was telling me they don't teach that stuff before third dan. That's on average maybe 10 years.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, like that's okay. If your goal is you want to be practicing the martial art of Aikido and eventually adding these things in and being able to use it, that's wonderful for you. But that's not, if a student is coming in and is looking for self-defense, that's not an acceptable time frame for me.
Yeah, if you wind up telling them, well, look forward to 10 or 12 years of training before you have some practical use. If they're kicking tires and they go find another art that says, hey, you can train here for a year and we'll get you some solid skills. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer, really.
Yeah, if that's what you want out of training, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is that basic solid skills doesn't take that long. Right?
Correct.
The difference for self-defense for most people is getting them comfortable with hitting or moving a human body, getting them able to generate power for both of those things, and then getting them solid soft skills and understanding of context. Those are the things that are the big wins.
Yes, absolutely. When you mentioned we're talking about the foundation, I recalled a senpai of mine years ago, and he came to Aikido from a Ryukyu Kempo background. And I think he was Nidan in Ryukyu Kempo, and he became Nidan and then Sandan in Aikido. And what I noticed about him is you could really tell that Kempo karate was his core art, and that he integrated the Aikido footwork and movement, and he was smooth, but you could always see that explosiveness that was always there. Like you could look and see that core, and it worked out really well for that. What I'm wondering is if the reverse were true. If somebody started with no martial background, got to be Shodan, Nidan, and Aikido, and then went to another art, would that Aikido always show through? And the answer is, to me, I don't know. I don't know if it would. Now, the only other example I can think of right offhand would be, what's his name? Roy Dean, who went from Aikido, as I understand it, to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But I think that those are complementary arts in the sense that they neither use strength. They use leverage and evasive movement. Of course, the palette is a little different, where it's a lot of heavy grappling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, whereas the standing throws and stuff in Aikido are a little different. But I think the principle is similar. And from what I understand, Roy Dean is a very talented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner because of that. But that's where I wonder, like, is the foundation sound? And one of the goals that I have with my students, and I think you mentioned this as well, is can they go visit another dojo and show that they are a respectable martial artist, and to me that means, is their foundation broad enough that they don't get completely lost when somebody covers basic how to hit, how to punch, or how to do some basic kicking, or really anything that a good martial artist should know at least some about.
Well, what I can speak to that is, I know a few people where Aikido is their core art and they've gone to other things. And the ones I know, yes, that has generally been the case. But let's be honest, there are people who are much better at Aikido than I am, and some of me about are that. So there are people who are just very good. I also one observation on that, because we used to, what my old club in when I started at university, what they used to do, because my wife finished a PhD there, so I would be coming back every once in a while, so we stayed in touch. And They would bring someone over once a year to do a self-defense course. So they were there. My instructor there, he's very explicit. He's doing Aikido. He's not doing self-defense. He's actually doing it quite practically, and he's very good at what he does. But what he does is not self-defense. He makes that clear to his students. But what we used to do is we used to bring Rory over once a year to do a course, or somebody else, or Randy King. Now it's usually I go over once a year, or now via Zoom, and do the things. And we get people in from Krav Maga, from other arts, other groups. Aikido people don't do appreciably worse at physical drills and self-defense classes than other martial artists. So I mean, that's a small data point, but in my experience, they don't do appreciably worse. Now, there might be some sampling bias because, of course, I tend to organize and pick self-defense instructors whose stuff works for me, and I'm from an Aikido background, so this might be different if it's somebody else. But my experience is that Aikidoka with a good training and do have that effect. And that's something with the training method in Aikido. It allows you to have good training, but it doesn't force you to do it. You see so many poor examples, because if you have this cooperative training, this can be truly cooperative training where the ukes are very actively working to make Nage better, and you're really trying to improve everybody. It's a wonderful thing, and you can learn very interesting things with that. And if you do it well enough, there are different teaching progressions. Takemusu Aikido, which is what one of my friends does, has a different progression in terms of how they do the techniques than, say, Ki, which is my background primarily. But that training method also leaves you space and for doing things that are not practical at all. And you wouldn't notice unless you interacted with somebody else, because you're training the people how to respond to the techniques. Right. And sometimes you get people, I'm sure you've experienced this, where you're like training with someone new and they're like, no, you need to change your grip to this and this so that my technique will work, type of thing. So I think it allows people to build a solid foundation, but it doesn't force it. And it's really dependent on who you get as an instructor and what dojo you're in.
It is. And I think with so many discussions on the internet and in person, where people talk about this art versus that art, it's so easy to lose track of the fact that any martial art is not like a franchise where the experience is going to be same dojo to dojo, instructor to instructor. In fact, it's so wildly different that you can't even say that there's this martial art is good or that one's bad. It really does come down to instructors. And that's one of those things with so many people, oh, you're a martial artist. Well, I've been looking for a martial art. What should I look for? This is one of my top pieces of advice to them, and say, really what you're looking for is a good instructor, a good teacher. The art really is not that relevant. I mean, with some exception, obviously, if somebody's in their 40s learning capoeira or, Taekwondo or something that's going to have a lot of hip flexibility requirements, probably not for you. But by and large, if you get a good instructor that can take and make their art suitable for you and teach you what you need to get the most out of it, then that's going to be a good fit. And I think Aikido, any Aikido instructor that views what they're teaching as like cookie cutter, everybody has to do things exactly the same way, is going to miss that mark. Just because, at least this is my experience, there are some Aikido techniques that suit shorter people, others that suit taller people, and you just can't say this is going to work. This one technique is going to work for everybody. And the one that comes to mind is Shio-nage, where you turn underneath somebody's shoulder.
Yeah,
that works great if your uke is your height or a little taller, or much taller, or it works fantastic. But if they're shorter, and I'm 6'4", so when I tried to do it on that young lady at 12 years old, and she was like 4'11", it was a mess. So, and there are many examples of that, and certain techniques will fit certain students better or not. But I think the goal, in my opinion, for any martial arts, regardless of what art you teach, is your students should not have huge gaping holes of things they don't know how to do, even if it's not strictly within your own curriculum. And I'd say one of those that I think applies to Aikido is being able to hit hard, like not necessarily hit like Mike Tyson, but you should be able to throw some good boxing punches and know what they are and be able to deliver them decently well. And if you can't, then how can you train to defend against them? Like that to me, it seems like a basic formula.
Yeah, I think that, again, if you're just doing martial art, I don't think we need to reiterate this every time, but if you're just
Sure.
doing martial art's sake, you don't need to have the strikes in there. But I agree that if nothing else, you want to have your ukes trained to be able to give solid attacks. I mean, one of my pet peeves, there's a few things that I really dislike that you see a fair bit within Aikido, not so much in the good dojos. One is when you have, I don't know if you guys have this in your style, but when you have the throws that are like you're throwing yourself because there's a hand coming at your head
Right.
type
Right.
things, like, no, if you don't throw yourself, they hit you. And the thing is that, yes, those actually work when you have someone who does all the elements, which means that is if it's a very convincing strike and they're off balancing you somewhere else, and they're doing the irimi, the body movement, and the projection, like, the sort of projection of that, those work pretty well. The way that you see them done a lot, it's like, if I let you hit me with that, nothing is going to happen to me.
Right.
There's no reason for me to throw myself. And one of friend of mine, Maja Soderholm, I hope I'm pronouncing Maya Soderholm, I'm pronouncing the name right. She's a Filipino sword instructor. She has this wonderful saying that if you want to learn how to fake, you have to be able to do it convincingly. You have to be able to
Yes.
actually project the hit convincingly.
Exactly. You have to sell it. And if
Yeah.
if it doesn't look like it's got form behind it and good body mechanics, you won't sell it.
If you can't do it, you probably can't sell it,
Right.
is the thing, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that's and there's a lot of things, like, for example, ground fighting is something that Aikido generally doesn't address.
Mhm.
I when I did the curriculum, we went kind of minimum viable. So basically, we're going to practice how to get up if somebody else is trying to pin you down. We're going to cover a 1 hour.
To me, that's a must. Like that's a must for anything.
Yeah.
Regarding self-defense or survival.
Yeah, and it's not like it's hard to, like, you do a 1 hour class on principles of ground movement a couple of times, and then you throw that drill in every once in a while because it's a safe drill. You're not training people to be able to go to the local BJJ school and compete. That's ridiculous.
Right.
But you just give people some basics. One thing you said earlier, with different techniques to different students. So we actually addressed that in our curriculum. Is from the yellow belt exam. So from the first exam, there's a space on the grading form where you tell me, if 2 weeks in advance, a technique that you want to do that's not already on there.
Okay.
And we used to do that so that, because some people are, partly to get out of the idea that some techniques are so advanced, because some people are really good at things that you'd at yellow belt that you'd normally see on like a blue belt syllabus. And this way they get a bit more individualization, and you also start getting people used to having a bit more agency. Because I think one of the things that's often missed out in self-defense training is, how do you interact with students in the dojo, the culture like? Because if you're training people to fall over every time you sneeze and scrape and bow and do that all the time, it doesn't really matter what techniques you do in the dojo. You're not training them to defend themselves.
Right. Yeah, and that aspect that has fighting has got the element of chaos in it. It's, things happen so unpredictably, and both in the military and in sport fighting, they'll say that your plan just goes immediately out the window the minute the clash happens. And I think training for that chaos and I like, the idea of stress inoculation to me is a crucial portion of it, to realize I can have a plan, but I need to be ready to adapt when things don't go according to that plan, or I try a technique and something goes wrong. Either I don't apply it right, I get evaded, somebody tries to reverse it, or just somebody's hurling in a direction that I didn't predict, and now things are going sideways. Like all of that part, and initially that seems daunting or frightening. What I've found is I start to introduce this, and I found that it was, if you organize it and present it correctly, even brand new white belts can get into it. You can, you're not going crazy. You're starting it, but saying, this is what could really happen. Things could go wrong. And because everybody knows, no matter what you do, you try something out, no matter what it is you're working on, things can go wrong. Like they like being taught what to do when things go wrong, or how to adapt, how to adjust, and then to keep their head, you stay calm. If you're stuck on a choreography and things that breaks, you can panic. Well, the panic is the worst enemy of anything, of any survival. but I found that it's a fun process. I have not had any of my students uh, get frightened or say, hey, this seems like it's too scary. You can read when people start getting anxious or nervous, or I don't know about this. You want to have that training a little bit out of the comfort zone, but not so far that they become paralyzed with fear.
Yeah.
And the more they get used to it, and I think it's a fun process, and my students love it, especially when like, okay, we're going to do randori tonight. Everybody's eyes light up, like, oh, great, this is going to be fantastic. I think it's an important part to get people used to that chaos, and to be ready, and to know that flexibility and movement and calm is going to be what prevails.
So that is a really good point, because the idea of Aikido, as a sort of the philosophical idea of Aikido, a lot of it is to be calm under pressure. Like, incoming forces aren't something you need to be opposing, you need to be tensing up with, but it's in my view, and again, for my training, for what I like to do, it's more useful to do that when there's actually something incoming that would tense you up. You need to train people. We need to practice under conditions that would be difficult for us. If someone is coming in with an out of distance slow motion attack, it's easy to stay calm with that.
Right.
If it's more in chaos, you're not going to get there immediately, but it's a good thing to practice towards. And the other thing is that you were saying chaos. Aikido is a martial art that adapts to the other person so much, that is so focused on using gifts that appear in the middle of a fight. It's so used to, oh, your arm is positioned this way, great, I can move it here. You're stepping this way, I can do this. It's so focused on this that it should thrive under chaos.
That's a great point.
The more things you have to do. And I think that the way it's classically trained, you have to be very, very good to get there. I mean, I don't think, I think it's a reasonably unproductive discussion to ask whether Shihan can make it work for real, because it is not relevant to us mere mortals, right?
Right.
But I think even so, not just people, there are people who are very good who can make it work like that. But I think maybe a faster way to get there, and because we know more about how coaching works these days, we have lots of really good data from athletic coaching. It's one of the things I love reading about. I did some research at uni, looking into these things, and just what are the elements psychologically and in terms of training that can speed up that process. And I think for the being able to use all of this Aikido, this adaptive part of Aikido, having some variable drills in it is one way to just speed it up massively. Not to mention that all of the research that I've come across suggests that if you're succeeding all the time while you're trying to learn something, your learning is very slow.
Very
you need
much
to
so.
be doing things at the edge of failure, right? Or at least a reasonable degree of failure. One of the
it's
things
around I think around 15-20% failure was the optimum, because that 15-20%.
Like 50% was great for learning in theory, but people were getting too frustrated.
Yes.
So
if it drops below 80%, then people start getting frustrated.
Yeah, the one that I think, like, I don't know, when I started Aikido, the way that we usually train is, you get 4 turns and then the other person gets 4 turns, like Izuki or Nage. So one of the ones that I've played with is training ukes that, and unfortunately I came across this after I was running the dojo, so I've only gotten to do it when I was back for seminars, is telling ukes, okay, what I want you to do is between each set, change your resistance. What you're aiming for is that Tori is successful 75% of the time. So 3 out of 4 times he can throw you. You're not changing your resistance within the set, because that's, messing up his feedback. But if he's managing less than that, ease up a bit. If he's managing more than that, if he's managing all of them, it's a bit. And I think that alone makes a massive, massive difference.
It does. Learning. It's funny you mentioned that, because I wind up doing the same thing. In fact, I had a fellow student of mine. He was a Kohai, but he started shortly after I did. But we had the same intention. And rather than doing 4 and 4, if we really got into a groove where we were starting to learn, I just say, keep coming. Just let's keep doing it. And we'd go, a minute or 2 minutes, just constant attack over and over, where I could start adjusting and playing with, all right, does this work? Does that work? And, fortunately, my instructor gave us the latitude to do that instead of sticking to the 4x4 formula. But it was a stage. You get to that stage where you're like, okay, doing 2 and 2 is pretty comfortable. I can, and then you adjust to, then the thing would be, I'd ask him, all right, give me some variables, switch up your footwork, change pressures, adapt, respond differently, rather than the same way every time, like be unpredictable, try to reverse it, throw a second attack in there, feint me, do a double pump where I don't know exactly when you're coming in. All of these things I found very, very helpful. And this was more from an influence of what I remember dealing with live opponents, what they would do. They'd try to be unpredictable on purpose, because deception is warfare, it's combat. And I felt it was beneficial to my Aikido, and it was fun to do with them, at least with him, because I know he was on the kind of the same frequency I was. But I wouldn't do it with every student, because you can get over their head really quick doing that. But the ones who are ready for it, and you say, hey, let's take this a little farther, and you get them out of their comfort zone. I like the way you describe that. Is a good uke won't let their nage rest in a comfort zone. If they're getting 95, 100% success, they got to start throwing in a little bit of the unknown factor.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two things I want to say on that. One is that actually, since we're talking about Aikido as a complete art, and this particular topic with the ukes, one of my friends who's also an instructor of mine, he's just published a book where it's literally called About Aikido, right? And he talks about Aikido and what it is and what it could be, maybe. And he's much more traditional than me in many ways, but he talks about, if we train ukes properly, the way that it's described in the art, the way that it's suggested that they should be trained, what we get would look very different and probably quite a lot more practical, even without.
That's a great point.
Elsewhere. And we disagree on a couple of things, but which is actually nice. I don't think you should be required to agree with your instructors and everything. I think that would be strange,
and impossible. I mean,
you get trained sycophanty, I guess, that way, right? So and you need people to have productive discussions with. But I really like the way that he puts things in the book, so I do recommend that. And he's got some very interesting ideas of what if we trained ukes properly. The other thing, which is actually to something you said earlier with this variability, that yes, you can start people on it very, very early. You can do very easy drills. And that's something I got a huge amount of resistance with from some people. And there's a really simple drill. And this is one I actually took this one from Ian, although I can't find the video anymore, from Ian Abernathy, which is for wrist grabs. It's one of the first things we do, but often we lack context. Right? They have some just teaching benefits, but there's the classical, someone is trying to take your sword. Okay, we don't have swords anymore. Modern context, what do we do with this? And it can be to stop people from leaving. But one drill is, as Tori, you're grabbing uke, you're grabbing the throat, you're grabbing the face, you're grabbing the testicles, and then they will grab your wrist potentially. There's other things that they could do, but they might grab your wrist to get your hand off. And original drill, because it's from karate, you get your hand out. But for us, we can now play with the locks. And no one's saying that's real, but it's just introducing these variables. But even when I introduced that one, somebody who was a little bit more of an advanced student also came and was like, what are you doing with this? And it's like, oh, we're doing this drill. I was like, yeah, but that's like really advanced. Like, that guy's been training a few weeks. He's doing it fine. Like, it's not. There's the perception of what is advanced and difficult when it comes to these things is often a little bit skewed. You do have to be careful. Like, you see some people bringing in things that students simply don't have the skills for.
Right.
Particularly with grappling, with clinch work, you sometimes see people try to do it from this, and the students clearly don't know how to do the basics of that. So it's just, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So you have to be careful to introduce things progressively. But you can absolutely do that. Is my opinion. Yeah.
No, I agree. Boy, I've loved this discussion. I think we could probably go on for quite some time, and we've sort of branched out a little bit from it. But I'll just say thank you for coming on the show, and I'll let you have the last word. Is there any kind of a wrap up point you'd like to make? And go right ahead.
Let me see. I did note a couple of things down. I think we've actually talked about everything. I think
Okay.
just one thing I wanna throw in, which is, because we're talking about the whole, it's like, I mean, maybe let me do a closing statement on, do I think Aikido is a complete art?
Sure.
I think when it's done well in the second sense of internally complete, yes, but only when it's done well. In the first sense of comprehensive fighting skill, no. I mean, it's very specialized. Most people who practice it will say that. I will say this as for when people are bringing things in, and this is a little bit of a personal bias of mine, maybe, just because a lot of what I see with intensity, right? They say, how do I, even within traditional Aikido, people who do things faster and harder think they're being more practical. That is not necessarily how that works.
True.
But it sure feels like it. And intensity feels very real. So when you're bringing things in, my opinion is that variability, variable input that you have to react to is more important than intensity. Intensity is also important, not disputing that at all. But intensity can make things feel real that aren't necessarily. To give one example,
That's a great point.
if you saw two people wailing on each other with blunt metal swords, and you saw two people kind of dancing a bit out of distance with the swords and trying to find openings, a lot of people would think the first one looked more realistic. If you change those swords for sharp ones, which one would people do?
Right.
So
Right.
which one is closer to the real? I mean, that's a particular example from weapons, but in general, I think intensity can have that seductive quality, right? Because also it's really fun. Like intense sparring is amazing. I love it so
Oh, it
much.
is. Yep.
But it sometimes when you bring things in, or when you're trying to make your thing more practical, look at what am I actually doing, and how am I training people? What
Sure.
feedback are they getting? What decisions do they have to make? And I think that's more valuable in some ways to kind of completing the art for whatever purpose you want, than saying, okay, well, I think we need to be more practical, so let's really go all out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's do the choreography really super fast.
Yes, super fast and hard. We'll judge our success by dislocated elbows.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, and as you said that, I just want to leave the listeners with one question. That is it possible for Aikido to evolve further into a more comprehensive art? And we won't answer that in this show, but just it's something to think about as we exit, or as people have listened to this show. Give it some thought. Give it some thought to what your Aikido, what you want from your particular martial journey. And I think we'll probably leave it there. Dan, thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been a great talk.
Thank you for having me on.
You bet. Take care. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Stay tuned for more episodes. I've got some great stuff on the way very soon. In the meantime, enjoy your training.